Why do we as women do this rise, crash, and burn, and then realize that I need to take life seriously?
Often we don't give ourselves permission to recover. And then I came down with pneumonia. Eventually, I was taken into hospital. And even then, the crazy thing is, I remember them saying to me, "We're admitting you." And I was like, well, I just need to pick up the kids first.
PCOS and endometriosis. The second part was the postnatal depression and the burnout. What were typically the symptoms?
With the burnout, that I'd had 3 C-sections in just over 4.5 years, because with my first I tried a natural delivery, but I had pelvic disproportion. As women, we're kind of conditioned to just keep going. If you're not changing the way that you eat and train, commonly women will experience things like belly fat, and that will be driven even more if we're not managing our stress.
How does this differ through races and ethnicities? Have you seen difference in Asian countries differently from any other ethnicities? Is there a correlation between the kind of exercise women do in this phase of their lives? Because you mentioned about something like high intensity training that you were doing earlier suddenly may work against you in many forms. Hello and welcome to the Kidsstoppress Podcast. And today we have with us Angela Foster, who is an award-winning nutritionist, a health performance coach, speaker, and host of the top-rated global podcast. Angela, I'm so glad that we connected on Instagram, and here we are recording a podcast today.
I'm so happy to be here, Mansi. It's lovely to be with you. Thank you.
Tell me, why do we as women need to go through, or as humans, why do we need to go through this rise, crash, and burn, and then realize that I need to take life seriously?
It's a really interesting question. And actually, some of my work is working with large corporations and investment banks to actually look at how can we better support women, because they're highly educated, very, very valuable. But most, or many women, should I say, not all, many women hit their 30s and they don't feel that they have enough support to combine their working life with a family life and be the mother to their children that they truly want to be. And I think we've got to support women better. We know there's a bit of a gender pay gap, but more than that, actually just looking at how we can support them with things like working from home. And COVID was amazing in many respects for women because they were able to do that. But now what we're seeing is this increasing return to the office, with some organizations saying you've got to be there 4 days a week, some moving to 5 days, which makes it really impractical for women as they're moving up through the ranks, because they don't always, until they get to that level of seniority, they can't necessarily afford all of the support in terms of housekeeping and nannying and things that they need. And so it's this sort of this chicken and egg scenario. And I think that's what drives them to think about leaving or causes burnout. Whereas when we look forward and look at them in midlife, they're so valuable, but we've lost them often along the way. And then there's another kind of gap again when we look at perimenopause with women not being supported. And so I think we need better support.
Absolutely. And I'm so glad that you say that, because I think more often than not, we don't realize that we need that support, but we don't want to ask for that support because we feel like we're going to be judged. I'm so glad that you mentioned that we as women, we hesitate from taking that jump or that plunge or asking for help because we often feel like I will be judged as being incompetent, or if I ask for help or if I take that break, I will be, victimizing myself or playing the victim card. And I'm so glad that you say that, because I know so many women who actually drop out of the workforce because they don't actually ask for help. So I'm so glad that you actually mentioned that.
I think often the support isn't there as well. I know, like, for example, when I broached the topic of maybe dropping for a short period of time, just when my kids were really young, of working 3 days a week, that was considered popping in. So that was not an option. So it was kind of 4 days. And I think so many women actually realize that when you move to 4 days, chances are you're going to be paid for 4 days, but actually working 5, because you're going to end up finishing that stuff from home. And I think that's the battle, right, that they're having. And then they're confronted with, not seeing their children, they're kind of, or seeing them very briefly in the morning, and then coming home and they're going to bed or have already gone to bed. It's really, really difficult when the kids are young and you want to have that time with them.
You mentioned about a couple of key tentpoles that you mentioned, which was about the PCOS and endometriosis. The second part was the postnatal depression and the burnout. What were typically the symptoms that you noticed at that point in time? Because I feel sometimes women are just passing through it without even knowing that here's a problem. I mean, they think it's all okay and it's just a day and this will go through and I'll be fine tomorrow.
Yeah, so they were all a little bit different. So when I look at like the PCOS and endometriosis, I think was really unfortunate. And, still now there's very little research done on women. We're getting better at it, but there's still a long way to go. And a lot of medical doctors aren't really trained in women's health. And so for me, I was very aware of the symptoms. I was aware of the fact that I was having, I'd gone a whole year at university without any periods. And the doctor's response was just simply put you back on the pill until you want to look at starting a family. It was never investigated. When I tried then to think about starting a family, and birth control has its own separate thing, right, that we now know a lot more about. But when I
Yeah.
started to think about having a family, and I realized how disrupted my cycle was, how much heavy bleeding, how much pain I had. Initially, when they ran some bloods, they didn't actually tell me what was going on. And I went through a series, and this is very common with women, a series of successive doctors to actually get diagnosed. And it took the point where I was struggling to walk because I had such a big cyst on one of my ovaries that it was beginning to twist. And that's when I was, taken into hospital quickly and I had surgery. And that's when they really discovered it. And I think this is the kind of thing, often we need to push quite hard to be listened to. With the burnout, that I'd had 3 C-sections in just over 4.5 years. I had 3 babies that had reflux because with my first I tried a natural delivery, but I had pelvic disproportion. So I was really, really depleted. And on the background of those long working hours as a lawyer, I felt excessively tired. And I think that I was struggling to keep up. But then there was also this part of me, I don't know if this will resonate with you, Mansi, or your audience, but as women, we're kind of conditioned to just keep going. So I had this narrative going
Yes.
on that you know that, and you kind of beat yourself up. So I was like, how can this be? And I remember sitting with a therapist and she was saying to me, you're putting too much pressure on yourself. And I was like how? I used to run multinational deals and here I am. The big thing is it takes me an hour and a half to get out. I'm so depressed to get out of bed in the morning. My son's dragging me out of bed to go to school. I feel like a complete failure. How can you say I'm putting pressure on myself? And I think that often we don't give ourselves permission to recover. We're like, once the baby gets to, that weaning age, instead of us taking a nap when they're napping, we're going and pureeing foods and doing all these things, trying to be super mum. And so I think there's an element of inbuilt pressure, but also it comes from societal conditioning that we have to do more to be more, whereas actually that all comes from within.
That's so beautifully said. And then coming on to your journey, of when did you decide that you want to be a nutritionist and a health and performance coach?
Yeah, so that transition happened. So after I kind of kept going, I was being treated. Eventually, my depression got so bad that I was on bipolar medications. And then I came down with pneumonia. I was being treated at home. And then eventually, I was taken into hospital. And even then, the crazy thing is, I remember them saying to me, we're admitting you. And I was like, well, I just need to pick up the kids first, and then I'll come back with a bag. And they were like, I don't think you understand.
Yeah.
Your lungs are so covered in it. We're going to put you in. And when I was in hospital, they told me that I was neutropenic. My white blood cell count was so low. And I realized that all these thoughts of kind of ending my life in my head, now my physical health was taking a toll. And there was a real possibility here. I might not make it. And I remember looking at photos of my children after they'd been to see me and just feeling this overwhelming sense of love and responsibility of like, what am I doing? I've got to get well. And what's so interesting, and Dr. Joe Dispenza talks about this a lot, about how we can heal the body with our mind, is that the
Yeah.
moment that I made a decision, I'm going to get really well, within 48 hours, my blood work started to change. And that was transformational for me. I had minimal damage compared to what they were expecting with the pneumonia. They thought they would have to intubate me. They never did. And I started to recover. And so when I came out of hospital, I realized that I'd begun to heal. And this was something quite magical. So I started to look into it. And then I started to do training myself. And initially, it was really to get myself well. And then over time, I started to realize this isn't just a me thing. So many women are experiencing similar situations. And that's when I started my practice, started my podcast, and started really, really focusing on women.
Let's move to quickly to your journey, and one of the posts that actually connected me and helped me know more about you was your post on ice bath and all that you speak about perimenopause, and diving straight in on ice bath for women. And you've done a beautiful post, but I'd love for you to walk through. Does it work for women? What are the kind of temperatures that work?
Sure. So I think with ice baths, and there's some kind of conflicting, I guess, opinions going around on this with ice baths. And I would say that all things, so like sauna, ice baths, high intensity interval training, all of these things are stresses that are good stresses on the body. But what we don't want to do is overstress the body by adding too many of them, particularly for women in stressful jobs, or they're like, running a busy household, and maybe they're doing multiple things, maybe they're caring for aging parents. But when we look at kind of the physiological things, there was a small study that was done that showed that women started to shiver at higher temperatures. So some of the benefits that come from that may mean that women don't need it as cold. However, when we then look at, other research, and we look at also a more kind of holistic approach to ice baths, which is about overcoming yourself and trying to avoid shivering and using breathwork techniques to really feel that sense of embodiment. And a podcast that I would, and we've got a page where we can link to further resources for your audience afterwards. But, I did a really, really good podcast on this with Laura Hoff. And she's just published a book, Secrets of the Ice Women. Her father is obviously Wim Hof, and how breathing techniques and things can help. And so I think it's like something that is sort of a almost wait and see, because I think looking at what is the intention behind the ice bath, what are you looking to achieve as a result of it?
Yes.
I do think that many people are spending too long, right? They're going in for longer than they need. And really, Suzanne Soderberg has done some great research on this. In terms of the total across the week, we're looking around 11 minutes, and that can be split into sessions of like 2 to 3 minutes, or even 3 to 4. I think if you're going to do something like an ice bath, you definitely, and Laura really focused on this, you want to build up slowly and build that resiliency. So starting with a cold shower, finish for about 15 seconds at the end, and really get your system used to it. And sometimes oscillating between hot and cold, helping your blood vessels dilate and expand, just can be helpful as well in terms of blood flow. And there's some benefits to doing that. But I think it's all about really working with your physiology, and also looking at the other stresses that you have going on in your life. We know that cold exposure improves dopamine. It can help with focus and concentration. It can help lower inflammation. It can help with brown fat. All these things are really amazing. But I think that when we look at the research, in terms of cardiovascular health benefits and things like that, then sauna is probably stronger. And so what I would say, go with what you enjoy. There's so many women I speak to, and they just naturally prefer the heat, and that feels more accessible to them. And if that's how you are, then go with that.
Right. That's actually very interesting that you mentioned that. Coming on to one of your posts where you talk about the importance of fiber in menopause, that was one of the posts that gripped me as well. So do you want to talk a little bit about that? Why is it so important? And really, let's take a step back and understand what
Yeah, for
really
sure.
happens in perimenopause and in menopause. What are the changes that are happening in a woman's body, and why is it such a crucial phase for us to kind of understand and learn more about?
Of course, yeah. So with menopause, so menopause is one day in your life, and everything before that is premenopause, or the build-up period is perimenopause, when things start to change. So
Hmm.
your hormones are going up and down. And then we have menopause, which marks one day in your life. It's 1 year from the date of your last period. And then after that, everything is post-menopause. And it takes kind of 5 years often for women's hormones to really adjust to that new baseline, which is much lower unless you're using hormone therapy. But when we look at what's going on in those perimenopausal years, which some experts will say can start from 35, I think it varies woman to woman, but certainly if you're in your 40s, you're probably experiencing some changes in your hormonal balance. One of the first things that we see is that progesterone starts to drop. And this can affect women's sleep. It can affect their anxiety levels, in particular, because it's linked often with GABA production in the brain, which is very calming for us. So as we start to move closer and closer towards that menopause, what we find is that we have a shorter menstrual cycle, then sometimes it goes longer. We might have a regular cycle and not ovulate at every single ovulation event, right? So we'll have a period, but we didn't ovulate that month. And if we're not ovulating, then we're not producing the same levels of progesterone, because the progesterone is produced by the corpus luteum, which is like a temporary gland that's left behind on the ovary after ovulation takes place. And in a situation of pregnancy, for example, that corpus luteum would continue to produce progesterone right up until the placenta fully takes over around week 12 to 13. So in perimenopause, if we're not having an ovulation every single month, that's naturally reducing our progesterone. And so we're really relying on our adrenals to support this. And if we're constantly pumping out lots of cortisol and we're really, really highly stressed, that can affect things further. And then as we move closer towards menopause, we also see significant disruptions in estrogen. And estrogen can go really high and then it can drop. And it's when it's dropping from sort of a higher thing that we tend to experience symptoms like hot flashes, which come for some women closer towards menopause. Estrogen also helps with serotonin and mood. And if you've got a loss of progesterone, you're going to be more estrogen dominant in any event. And when you're more estrogen dominant, you can experience heavy bleeding and things like that. And so a lot of women will get very heavy bleeds, blood clotting, and things like that. So there's so many symptoms. When we look at like what's happening from a physiological perspective and why our health risks increase, we also see that baseline cortisol, so stress hormone, is going up during that period in any event. We're seeing high levels of inflammation, which we know are linked to many of the chronic diseases that we see. We see poorer insulin sensitivity, so now women are not managing their blood glucose quite so well. We see that estrogen is a very strong stimulus for muscle protein synthesis. And so with that loss in estrogen, we need to work a bit harder on our resistance training to gain that tissue, which is really important because we're losing both muscle mass and strength and power, really, with aging. And so all of these things are going on. And then we also see some increase in body fat for some women. That's not in all cases, but there's certainly more of a redistribution of body fat if you're not changing the way that you eat and train to really accommodate those changing hormones. And so commonly women will experience things like belly fat, and that will be driven even more if we're not managing our stress. So it's a time of our lives where I like to embrace seeing it as more of an opportunity for change, an opportunity to step into ourselves. Often we've, been raising our children, and now this is a period of time we can focus more on ourselves. And really it's shining a light from a health perspective on where we might need to change things to really protect ourselves against things like type 2 diabetes, heart disease, and dementia.
I absolutely love that we've used this period up until now to raise our children, and now it's the time to raise ourselves. Would love to know, Angela, how does this differ in through races and ethnicities? Have you seen a difference? Like, do you see that it, perimenopause, menopause affects women in, Asian countries differently from that in Western or any other ethnicities?
Yeah, so it's really interesting. So I did a post on this, as you probably saw, that went quite
Yes,
viral around, Japanese
especially the
women, and it was
Japanese
very
women.
controversial.
Yes, yes, yes. That was very
And it's very
interesting. I
controversial.
love that. I love that.
I mean, there's some evidence that they embrace this more as a second spring. Then some Japanese women will come forward and say, actually, it's not talked about enough. We know that their diets are quite different. They have phytoestrogens, more soy and things like that support better hormonal balance. There's definitely research that I've looked at that if you can have a more positive mindset, you're probably going to have a better experience. And we know that, right? We were talking about the very beginning of this episode, just about how my mindset was affecting my health. So the mind and body
Yes.
are intimately connected. And so that can have a profound impact. I do like this idea of it being a second spring and women really being valued because we've acquired a lot of wisdom by this point in our lives. And, from a health perspective, it probably isn't. Pregnancy is risky anyway. Childbirth is risky. Probably reached an age where it's too risky now to have children, but we can take on this other role of first focusing on ourselves and really expanding areas of our life and our spirituality that we hadn't maybe had the opportunity to before, and then hopefully later moving into that grandmothering role. So I think it's a really beautiful time, but it isn't without its disruption. And so I think that understanding from a holistic health perspective, how can we best support ourselves? And then also looking at whether hormone therapy might be an appropriate adjunct. It's never going to lift the weights for us. It's not going to give us the right
Absolutely.
food, but it's helpful alongside.
Right. You mentioned about strength training and lifting the heavy weights. I want to know, is there a correlation between the kind of exercise women do in this phase of their lives with perimenopause and menopause? Is there a correlation? Because you mentioned about how something like high intensity training that you were doing earlier suddenly may work against you in many forms versus strength training or walking or any of that. So you want to talk to us about that?
I think what we see is actually we need a stronger stimulus, but we also need to balance the nervous system. So when I'm working with clients, we monitor HRV really closely because that's a metric that tells us it's a very non-invasive way of looking at, and that's really the variation between someone's heartbeat. So we look at their sleep, we look at their resting heart rate, we look at their HRV, we look at their breathing rate and their body temperature to see how are they coping with the stress? Because again, I think it's really individual. When we lose estrogen, we know that we have to work a bit harder in terms of gaining that mass. So we can do kind of higher repetition ranges when we're younger, and maybe get better body composition results more easily. We also need to do some high intensity work because we know that we lose the fast twitch muscle fibers faster. However, that has to be balanced out a bit like we were talking about ice baths with the woman herself, her stress profile, and what's going on in her life as well. And I know it's really, really interesting because I did a podcast recently with the CEO of Glycanage, which is a test that looks at really inflammaging that we know is one of the main drivers, right? It's one of the hallmarks of aging. And they had done a case study actually on a 35-year-old woman who had looked at glycans, which, as I say, is a good way of looking at the immune system and inflammaging. And she was a CEO of a company. She had 2 young children, and she was doing high intensity interval training. And when they looked at her glycans, she was aging 15 years ahead of her age. So she had a biological age of 50. They swapped that out and took out the high intensity work and replaced it with yoga. And within 12 weeks, she had a biological age back down to her chronological age. That's not to say that every woman
Wow.
needs to stop HIIT training and do yoga. I think what we need to do is look at it and go, what's the other stress in your life? And can we, if we're going to do some HIIT, because I think HIIT is really powerful for improving insulin sensitivity. It's short, it fits with many women's timelines, but I think we've got to keep it short and have lots of recovery in between. Whereas I think what happens is as women's body shapes start to change, they start to layer in more and more exercise. So they might be going to like an F45 class 3 times a week. And these are classes that are kind of an hour long, and it's causing a lot of extra stress. If you keep ramping up the stress without recovery, that's when it can be counterproductive to your goals. So it's really individual. And I guess contrary to what we see many experts saying, oh no, there's no place for zone 2 for women. Personally, having interviewed experts in this, I believe there is a place. And I think that it's amazing for recovery. Going out in nature, even if you do it on a treadmill, being at that lower to moderate intensity, which really the upper end of zone 2 you can find most easily as a general guide. If you're using a heart rate monitor, it will be 180 minus your age. And both zone 1 and 2, even when you're doing it slowly, I've interviewed experts on this, has endocrine benefits for you, it has immune system benefits, it improves blood flow, improves recovery from your workouts, and it's really good way of active recovery. So the way I see it is there's a place for working at all rep ranges, there's a place for working at all ranges within cardio. I think within the aerobic system, I think if you're pushing in the sort of middle zone, and I've posted about that consistently, or you're doing too much HIIT, then it can be counterproductive. But they all have benefits. We've just got to get that physiological load right to match your recovery.
Right. So if you have to break down a week of 7 days into different kinds of workout for women, what would that look like?
So if they were looking at it and they were like, okay, I want to set aside 45 minutes a day where I'm going to go and do something for myself, then I would say
Yeah.
that if you can do 3 full body strength resistance sessions, that would be great. If you're someone who loves to lift and you want to do more than that, then I would start to split between upper and lower to be able to do 4. Otherwise, you're going to see limited recovery. I think within that, if your stress levels are okay and you're not burned out, then you could put in a HIIT session. So, for example, we know that the Norwegian 4x4 protocol, which is where you do 4 minutes at a higher intensity with 3 minutes on a very low intensity recovery. You repeat that 4 times through. That improves your VO2 max, and that's your maximum aerobic capacity. That again is something we
Right.
want to look at with aging. And you could do that once every 2 weeks, or if you really were looking at a block where you wanted to improve it, once a week. If you were doing an upper body workout and you had that resiliency, you could tag a few short sprints on the end of your workout. But then the rest of it, I would make up with yoga, with walks, with lower intensity stuff to fuel that active recovery and really rebalance your system.
Amazing. You also talk about the importance of fiber and protein. Why is fiber so important in the perimenopause and menopause stages, and the protein as well? And do you feel that
Yeah.
vegetarians have a disadvantage to it?
All great questions. So first of all, fiber. So vegetarians will be getting a lot of fiber, and fiber
Yes.
we know is really, really healthy for our gut microbes, right? So I know
Yes.
there's a lot of diets out there around carnivore and things like that. I think we're missing out on many micronutrients, polyphenols, which feed our healthy gut bacteria, fiber, which supports our gut bacteria. And as we are going through those perimenopausal years, we're actually seeing changes in the gut microbiome. We see changes in something called beta-glucuronidase, which regulates kind of repackaged estrogen, if you like, through the body. So fiber is really, really healthy, and it helps with gut motility. It helps with detoxification as well. It also helps with blood glucose control. So I think there's a place for having a diet that has lots of plants within it, and certainly focusing on variety over some kind of fiber threshold that you're trying to get to. Just lots and lots of colorful foods will give you those antioxidants and polyphenols with the fiber alongside. With protein, what we're looking at is we need to stimulate muscle protein synthesis, and as women get older, they tend to develop more anabolic resistance, so it's not as easy to gain new tissue. And so where we might have been fine on, say, 25 grams of protein, now we need more like 30 or 40 grams of protein within a serving to stimulate that muscle protein synthesis. So generally speaking, the guidelines, which still fit within longevity goals, would be somewhere between zero point 0.8 grams to 1 gram of protein per pound of lean mass, or some people say per pound of body weight to make it easier. If you're overweight, that's going to be target body weight, because if you're vastly overweight, you're not going to eat 250 grams of protein. That would be a lot
Yeah.
and probably too much. We're looking at target body weight. So that's kind of a good idea. With vegetarians, whenever you're having protein, whenever you're having carbohydrates, right, you're having protein and carbs together. So often there is a higher carb intake that's going alongside. But whether or not you gain or lose weight will be determined by whether you are taking in more calories than you're burning, right? Although we can look at optimizing hormones so that we're keeping insulin stable, because if we have high insulin, we're going to promote more fat storage. If we have high cortisol, we promote more fat storage. So we definitely, I'm not saying calories in, calories out is everything. We need to look at the hormonal balance. However, you're going to be eating naturally more carbs, but they're also wrapped up in fiber if you're having whole food carbs. If you're eating processed foods, that's different. And the fiber actually excretes some of the calories from the body. But I would say that making sure that you are an active person so that you've got good insulin sensitivity, you're looking after your muscle mass, you're walking and doing things like that regularly, is going to help you have improved blood glucose control as part of it. For women then, like post-workout, if it's harder to get the protein in, this is where sometimes having a plant-based protein shake can be helpful to get that recovery in post-workout. That can be a good tool. And you need to kind of just focus on a variety of foods to making sure you're getting all the essential amino acids, because one of the most important ones with muscle protein synthesis is lucene. And we know the trigger for that is about 2.7 grams of lucene. That can be quite hard if you're not having animal-based foods to find. But if you have something like a pea protein isolate, generally you'll see that in that serving.
Right. That's so interesting that you mentioned that. And any other foods that would actually have that leucine that one can get?
It's difficult. I think what you need to do is just make sure that you're combining lots of different protein sources together. So you're adding
Okay.
if you're having like a nice big salad, you're adding some nuts, some seeds, and different things.
Interesting. Also, you mentioned about the different compositions, and it actually makes me wonder, how does your supplement stash change from your 20s to your 30s to your 40s to your 50s? How does that go around? And let me give you a background to that. I feel like people are overdoing the supplements because they're so vulnerable. They're just assuming everything they see online to say, okay, this has got to work for me. And we also see a lot of people overdoing it and then finding a problem to the assimilation of that supplement. So, and that assimilation or the extra supplementation is what's causing the problem. And what necessarily works for somebody may not work for the other. So, how would you break that down for someone?
100%, and I think we see this as well. When I was doing this interview with Glycanage, they looked at so many biological age tests, and what they were finding is the people that were the kind of quote unquote biohackers who were doing all of the hormetic stresses that we've been talking about, the sauna, the red light therapy, the high
Yeah.
intensity, all of the endurance training, everything, the hit. And then they were having loads and loads of supplements. They were aging faster. People who are doing too much exercise were aging at a similar rate to somebody who is moderately overweight and sedentary. So I think that we have to have a food first approach. Nature has given it to us, and we know that nature, because of the food matrix, when you're looking at one micronutrient, it's coming along with others in food that are supportive to it. So I would always start there, regardless of which decade you're in. I think there are certain areas of support. So for example, here in the UK, we don't get much sunlight during winter. And particularly if you are from an ancestral perspective, you're from somewhere warmer, your vitamin D receptor genes probably aren't going to work that well in the UK either, because you're used to more sun exposure. So you might even need a little bit
Yeah.
more vitamin D supplementation. But looking at that with getting a blood test done, it's super cheap to do, and finding out where your vitamin D is allows you to then calculate how much vitamin D you might need. And getting
Right.
sun exposure in the summer is the first priority, right? Within being sensible about it with UV light. But then magnesium, we know many women and men are also deficient in, because it's hard to get. I think you were mentioning when we spoke before about a post that I put out around how magnesium, slightly higher levels at 550 milligrams, have been shown in the research to support brain health and reduce cognitive decline and brain
Yes.
shrinkage, particularly in women. So I think that's something that it's sensible to potentially look at a supplement, because the soil has been depleted. I think if you're not eating a lot of oily fish, then having omega-3, we know that helps to lower inflammation within the body. So I think those three are really important for many women across the board, not decade specific. But then when we start to look at as we move through, we know that NAD, for example, halves about every 20 years. So we're going to be losing NAD. We have a salvage pathway that recycles it, and this helps with energy in the body. But taking some NAD precursors and a supplement that helps optimize your salvage pathway. I'm a big believer in taking things that are precursors to get your body to do the work and optimize its efficiency, as opposed to trying to take concentrated things that are trying to replace and are kind of out of alignment, if you like, with nature. Similarly, there are certain supplements if you need mitochondrial support. Urolithin A can help with that. There are some peptides that can really help with healing. I did a really good podcast on peptides, but that's not intended to take peptides consistently, and it's very expensive to do that. You would generally cycle, right? You would do a month and then cycle off. So I think understanding how to build a supplement routine and working with someone based on your needs at the time is much better than just taking loads and loads of supplements that you don't really know why you're taking. So the other thing I was going to mention, just supplement wise, I think that can be really helpful for many women is creatine. And I think that can be particularly helpful in perimenopause, I've noticed, when women are experiencing brain fog. So it can help
Yes.
support your athletic goals, your resistance training, but it's just really important for helping with energy in the brain. And there's ongoing research now in relation to how much creatine and whether it might be better. I have an interview actually coming up with Darren Kando, who's kind of the world leading expert on creatine, to talk about should we be kind of not drip feeding it, but doing it in micro doses across the day to help it cross the blood-brain barrier, or what's the best way? So that's a really interesting space. But most women that I work with, and I know myself, just having 5 grams of creatine monohydrate a day has made a really, really material difference. And we know as well for women who are struggling with poor sleep, so this might be women who've got young children and keep being disturbed, for example, or women in perimenopause, or just a part of your life where you're not sleeping as well. Creatine can help to make up for some of those sleep deficits. So that's something, and it's a really super well studied supplement. It's not expensive to take. I do think if you look for Crea Pure, which is a few pounds extra, that's better tolerated. But creatine monohydrate is really the one to look for there.
Sure. And there are a lot of nutritionists who mention about the side effects of creatinine on the kidneys. So do you have a counter argument to that?
Yeah, I think that's really largely debunked. There isn't really any evidence. If somebody had kidney problems, then we might not give them creatine. But yeah, there's not normally an issue otherwise.
Right. The last bit on intermittent fasting for women, especially post 40s. So should women be doing intermittent fasting? Second is, does it change pre 40s and post 40s?
Great question. So, intermittent fasting, which is really basically designing an eating window, right? So, you're eating for a certain number of hours during your day, and then you're being without food. I think that from children onwards, we can look at a 10 to 12 hour overnight fast. That works for most people. It helps with our metabolism, it helps us go into that deep repair at night. If we're having food too close to when we're going to bed, we start to produce melatonin around 9, 10 p.m. We naturally become less insulin sensitive when melatonin is being produced. So we want to limit blue light at night, encourage that melatonin release, but ideally try and eat 2 to 3 hours away from bedtime. And then having an overnight fast can be really, really helpful. When we look at the fasting research, it seems to show that if we really want to stimulate full cellular autophagy, that doesn't happen in most people until about 3 or 4 days into the fast. That depends on one's own metabolism. Dr. Voltalongo has the fasting mimicking diet, which I think can be great for women because it has less calories, and you do that for a few days. And that has been shown in the research to help mimic the effects of a longer fast, but you're still having some food.
So, what is fasting mimic? What do you mean by
The
fasting
fasting
mimicry?
mimicking diet is something that he's designed with extensive research to basically mean that your body's still in that state of ketosis, so it's fasting, but you have got some micronutrients coming in. So that's something people can have a look at. He has a whole kit that he uses. I'm not advertising it, but that can help people to do this. When we look at longer term fasts and women doing it, I think the key thing is it just comes back to that stress, right? Our body's constantly trying to maintain homeostasis. And if we just put too much in and increase that allostatic load, fasting is another form of stress. I think that it's very, very individual from one woman to the next. Women who are carrying a bit more weight probably are better able to fast. Whereas if you look at a lean woman, it's going to put much more stress on her system, particularly if she's exercising. Exercise is an amazing tool for autophagy. And so I think if you're a regular exerciser, then making sure you're refueling post workout can be a good thing. So ideally, I think if you're looking at, for most women, around 10 to 12 hours overnight, that's really good. If you want to look at doing a shorter, kind of longer term fast, but a couple of times a year, then looking at something like the fasting mimicking diet might be the way to go. But I think there's ongoing research in relation to fasting. A lot of people were skipping breakfast. Definitely the research, if we look at Dr. Sachin Panda, his work and things, actually, if you're going to fast, it's better to eat earlier in the day. But that doesn't fit with many people's lifestyles, right? Because they want to have
Yes,
with their family.
absolutely.
Yeah, and so I think
Absolutely.
that 10 to 12 hours works very well for most people. But if you're looking at that sort of autophagy, or you're trying to reset your metabolism because you've got some health problems, then working with a medical doctor, a functional medicine doctor, to design a fast appropriately could be helpful.
Right. And one of the last few questions, which is working out during your luteal phases. Do you feel like it's important to consider that or not?
Yeah, this is quite a controversial question. I think that it's so individual, woman to woman. I really think if you, and I've always worked out during my luteal phase, I think if you feel good, I would look at your heart rate variability. And I don't mean necessarily looking on your wearable to see what the algorithm is showing you as to recovery, because I don't think they're designed for female bodies, and we don't know how these algorithms are really built and whether they're giving us the best information at this point. But we do know that if we see your heart rate variability dropping, then it's time to factor in some more recovery. But if you're managing to maintain that and you feel good and you want to work out, then work out. So it's very individual. I don't really believe that you can say, oh, I'm going to do this type of workout for days 1 through 7, and then I'm changing this 7 to 40. Most women's cycles are not that regular in any event. How they feel is very different. And we've got to look at that whole stress index overall. One thing that is going to happen is your body temperature is going to rise slightly in that luteal phase because you've ovulated. And so you may find it harder to tolerate things like high intensity exercise or saunas and things like that. So I think being mindful of that as well is really important. But really, I come at it from the nervous system and stress approach, because that is interacting in our hormones. And, Dr. Sarah Swale has she was formerly known as Dr. Sarah Gottfried, has great books on this. It's
Yes.
Hormone Cure, one of my favorite books.
Right. Last bit on your favorite books that women should read on women's health and wellness.
So definitely that one that I just mentioned, The Hormone Cure, I think is a really, really good book. I think Dr. Libby Weaver, who I've interviewed, has some great books around rushing women syndrome, Exhausted to Energize. They're really helpful. Dr. Lara Bryden, she has the Period Repair Manual and the Hormone Repair Manual. Those are really, really
Hmm.
good as well.
Right. Your favorite podcast on women's health.
My favorite podcast, specifically on women's health. So, I mean, I guess one of the ones that I've been on recently, who I think is doing a really amazing job, is Dr. Stephanie Estima.
Hmm.
Obviously, my podcast, we also focus on women's health, but there's some really, really great ones out there.
Right. And one of the last few questions is collagen, right? And I recently read in a post which said that taking external collagen is actually not going to help because it cannot be taken through external sources and it has to come in through food. So would love to get your perspective on does taking external collagen help? And in that also taking marine collagen versus any others.
I mean, the research around marine collagen versus animal-based collagen, I'm not sure that it's 100% clear. I tend to take a marine-based collagen. I like collagen. I think I'm a big fan of it. We know that collagen is reducing with age, and unfortunately, this is like a not very nice stat, is that women post-menopause lose 30% of their collagen within the first 5 years of menopause. So taking collagen alongside a little bit of vitamin C, I think can be really good. There's different types of collagen. Type 1 is more focused on the skin.
Yeah.
And you can take multi collagens. I think that collagen peptides, the way that I understand it within the body, when you're taking it, it actually is stimulating your body to produce more collagen as well.
Right.
So I think they are good. And actually, it's probably one I should have mentioned with aging alongside like creatine that I think can be really positive.
Interesting. Thank you so much. Thank you so much for being with us today. For everybody who's listening to this podcast, Dr. Angela has some incredible stuff that she shares on her Instagram. Would totally urge you, and I'm going to leave the links in the show notes below. So please go ahead and follow her because I absolutely love some of the stuff that she shares. And it really, really resonates. I don't know how, but I just feel like, oh my God, I was thinking about it. How did she know? She just posted about this. It's literally like that moment when I read your post sometimes.
Oh, thank you.
And just a last parting thought on, through your entire journey, you've kind of been through so much, and then now we were here to everybody who thinks that they need to burn out to achieve so much, to do so many things. We're all having our to-do list flowing over. Why is it time to just take charge of your health?
So I would say that when you focus on you, that's when the magic happens, right? And I think
Yeah,
that for every woman listening to this, give yourself permission. I'm giving you permission to just spend that time focusing on you. Everyone benefits, right? Even when we look at things like we were talking about heart rate variability, we know that the electromagnetic field of the heart is much more energetic, right, in terms of how it can be sensed outside of the body than the brain, right? The magnitude
right.
of it. And so just by being more in resonance, becoming more embodied with yourself, focusing on these practices, even if it's just 1 minute of breath work 3 times a day, but making a little bit of time for you is going to have a huge effect on your relationships, on your success. Things happen faster. Just connecting with you and giving yourself that little bit of time. I don't think you'll ever regret that. It's an investment and it's so worth it for a multitude of ways.
Thank you. Thank you so much for being with us today. For parenting tips, celebrity interviews, recipes, conversations with experts, DIYs, and lots more. Subscribe to Kidsstoppress now.